Hello, and welcome to our first lecture for History 104, History of Western Civilization, Part 2. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about some background information. Most of our class this semester is going to be spent talking about the transformation of Europe. It is mostly going to be a class focusing on Europe and the places that it interacts with. But we're going to spend most of our time this semester focusing on the transformation of Europe into a more modern society, one where the politics, economics, military, religious, and social structures that we're perhaps more familiar with today grow and emerge and evolve. And so, for those discussions to make sense and those discussions of how things have changed to make sense, it makes I think, some sense to begin with explaining a little bit, giving you some generalized background into what life was like before. So, in other words, what was medieval and ancient Europe like, so that we can actually see and detect and describe a change from that into the modern world. So, that's our goal for today. We're going to be talking in general terms about the background of medieval Europe and the social, political, economic, technological, and material structures that characterize medieval Europe. So, where we're going to begin is we're going to talk a little bit about the structures that characterize ancient and medieval Europe. We're going to talk about economics, politics, religion, technology, material culture, all of those things kind of in one. And in order to take on such a big topic, we are going to have to speak in some generalized ways. And that's a little bit dangerous to do. Because when we talk about the medieval period, Middle Ages and medieval, by the way, mean exactly the same thing. Medieval is just a Latin transliteration meaning Middle Ages. So you can really just use them interchangeably. And when we talk about the Middle Ages or the medieval period, it really is quite a broad sweep of time and a large geographical area. So, depending on which historians you talk to, we're talking about a time period between the end of the 400s and, say somewhere around 12 to 1400 AD. So, and it really does vary by some centuries. Some historians will put the end of the medieval period with the First Crusade. Some people will put the end of the medieval period with the Italian Renaissance. Some people will put it with the Protestant Reformation. It really just depends on who you're talking to. It's not really important exactly where you draw the line. But the important thing to know is that, generally speaking, a lot about how things work in Europe is really going to begin to change at the end of the medieval period and begin down the pathway to being something more like what we recognize today. But during that time, from about, say, 500 and between then and, say, 1100, to be conservative in our estimate, life was very different in many significant ways. And the first and foremost of those significant differences that you must know and understand is that life was really profoundly centered on local identities, local politics, and kind of local experiences. For most of that time period, the great majority of people are going to make their living as farmers one way or another, either as farm owners or as farm workers. That is the majority of how the economy works. And most people do not have the opportunity to travel a lot. There's exceptions to this. Many people do not necessarily communicate extensively with territory outside their own immediate environment. Many people don't have strong political connections with people outside their own immediate environment. And for all of those reasons, plus the difficulty of communication in a time when there's no telephone, telegraph, or railroad or any kind of means of moving quickly from one place to another, and moving information quickly, aside from boats, I suppose would be the fastest way, and literally moving a physical message from one place to another, communication is somewhat limited in between regions, in some places, a lot of places, motion of people is limited. And people's general sense of politics and identity was also very much more wrapped up in their local politics and identity than we would think of as normal in the modern world today. So, for instance, if you were to snatch up a person out of Central Europe in the year 900 and plop them down on the moon and have an alien come by and ask them, what's your deal? Who are you? Where are you from? That person would first and foremost very likely answer with the name of their town or village. They would say, well, if you'd like to know where I'm from Orleans, or I'm from Aachen, or I'm from Ram, or I'm from, pick a town, I'm from London. I'd say they're from the big city of London. And if really pressed, they would then perhaps go to the region and explain, I'm an Aquitaine, or I'm Burgundian, or I'm Saxon, or wherever it is that they're from. It would take quite a lot of pushing and specific questioning to get them to the point where they would identify a national identity. It's not that people didn't have kings and emperors during this time period, they certainly did. But the importance of centralized government was much, much lower, generally speaking, during the medieval period than it will be during the modern period. Most people's whole sense of identity, their whole notion of who they owe loyalty to, who they are as people, was much more restricted, much more locally focused. They might have a broad notion that, yes, well, I guess as a Burgundian, we're technically subjects of the King of France, sort of, so I guess we're kind of French. But it wasn't something that, for the most part during this time period, would have been a strong connection people made. So things are very local, and conditions vary tremendously from one location to the next, sometimes with really, I guess, a small degree of difference. So, later in a moment, when we talk about economic conditions, you should be aware that there's not a ton of consistency. That even though everybody's using the same basic systems of making a living, the actual whether that played out as a very comfortable way of making a living or a very oppressive way, difficult way of making a living, could be different in as small a distance as from one farm to the next farm. Things really were kind of hashed out and negotiated face to face, person to person, instance to instance. And that was much more the way people thought of the world and politics and economics and everything else kind of working. Their loyalties, their connections, their interactions, their economic security, everything was kind of worked out locally without a great deal of sense of a kind of uniform way things are. So that makes it a little bit complicated to speak in generalities. So we're going to try to keep it to the very broadest strokes going forward, and not get too hung up on the idea that circumstances would be absolutely the same for everyone all the time, because they certainly would not be. Okay, so moving on. Okay, so first category that we're going to take on, and one of the major ways that medieval Europe is very different from today's Europe and the Americas and elsewhere, is that agriculture was absolutely the most important part of the economy. It was the whole engine on which the economy functioned in medieval Europe. That is how people made a living, and it was how people became wealthy. How much wealth you had really was directly tied to how much land you owned, and how productive that land was for farm and agricultural purposes. So, agriculture was absolutely critical to how people made a living. Most people are going to be predominantly farming just to provide for themselves with a little bit left over. We'll talk about exactly what they do with that in just a second. But nevertheless, you have some people at the top of the chain who own huge amounts of land. And they do end up turning quite a bit of profit as a result of that. But nevertheless, the way they make their money is directly or indirectly through farming. So, how do medieval people turn land into profits? Well, the chief way to do that is to make sure that it's in some kind of agricultural production. And how large landowners managed to accomplish this, how they managed to be wealthy, was through a process that was extremely common throughout in the entirety of Europe, throughout pretty much the entirety of the time period we're talking about. Between 500 and 1100, many, many, many people fell into a category we could describe as peasant farmers. And they worked for a landlord. Now, what made a person a peasant? Yeah, the term itself is a little bit squishy. It's a little bit varies depending on who you're asking. But what made a person a peasant farmer often was that they had a contractual arrangement with a person who owned the land and they were tenants on that land. Now, there are people in Europe who are free farmers who own their own land and farm it, and that's how it goes. There are people who work as farm labor, but they don't have these tenancy contracts. Those are a little bit more uncommon in the time period we're talking about, but they do exist. And there are people who do other jobs. There are people who are in, especially in places like towns and villages, large size ones, artisans, craftspeople, professional builders, that kind of thing, that don't really do a lot of farming on their own. They could be bakers, and that's all they do. But they are relatively uncommon. Towns and villages of enough size to support a full-time professional in that way are relatively uncommon and not particularly populous in this time period. They do exist. There are some cities, London, Paris, etc. But generally speaking, the great majority of people live rurally, and the great majority of people do actively farm. And the great majority of the people who actively farm as tenant farmers. So they don't own the land, somebody else does. They just work on it. Now, we're speaking here again in generalizations, but this is how most people live during most of this time period. There would be a landlord, and that's where we get the word landlord from. They're a lord that owns the land that would make that land turn into money by basically coming up with contractual arrangements between tenants to actually do the work. And these arrangements were two-sided. They went back and forth. They had advantages for both sides, and they had obligations for both sides. And when we think of peasants now in the modern world, often our image of them is really colored by movies and books and things. And in those places, in these fictionalized accounts, peasants are often depicted as very downtrodden and oppressed and treated very badly and having very bleak and colorless lives. And that's not necessarily the case. It can be quite misleading. What historical records actually seem to show us is a very much more interesting and varied story. That being said, let me speak in just kind of broad terms about what the relationship between tenant and landlord generally entailed. Okay. So, as I mentioned, both sides have obligations. On the landlord side, the landlord would be expected to provide, first and foremost, land. They would be expected to provide a field or a set of fields that would be rented to the tenant. And the tenant would then farm that piece of land for themselves. They would be in charge of doing the plowing and the planting and the harvesting and the weeding and whatever else needed to be done to get a crop in. Sometimes landlords had strict ideas about what they wanted farmed. Sometimes they didn't. It really just kind of depended. But this parcel of land would be made available to the tenant family, and the tenant family would farm it. And usually people did live as family units. And take on the contract in that way. And so the landlord provided land to farm. The landlord also provided housing. People's houses were supposed to be built by the landlord and broadly maintained by the landlord. So if they needed a new roof or wall repair or there was storm damage or something, the landlord was supposed to take care of that. Minor upkeep and cleaning and stuff like that was obviously the occupant. It was the tenant's job to take care of that side. But the landlord was supposed to provide housing. He was supposed to maintain housing. He's supposed to provide the land that the family would work. And then, in addition to that, they're expected to provide certain amenities. So the landlord would be expected to provide shared pasture. So if most of the fields on the land were divided into, farmland where wheat or vines or grapevines or whatever else was barley, whatever else was being grown, at least some of the land would be set aside for cows and sheep and goats to graze. And this would be kind of a collective communal territory that the landlord would provide access to all his tenants. So you, as the tenant, had a spot where you could bring your animals down to graze next to the landlord and everybody else's animals. Also, the landlord would provide access to other things, like access to the woods, if there was wooded area, and generally there was. And this would enable the tenant to pick up, they would be legally allowed to pick up any fallen wood on the ground to use as firewood. They were generally not allowed to cut trees. This was forbidden and something only the landlord would do. But they were allowed to pick up any fallen wood to use as firewood. They're allowed to use any resources they find in there. They're allowed to collect things like hazelnuts or other things that might have grown wild and fallen down. You can see in this image, what this slide shows is a calendar, actually. It was an illustrated calendar that showed the different things that happen throughout the year on a farm. And so you can see some elements on there, like in that second panel from the top. So on the top row, the second one in from the left, what those guys are doing is actually collecting manure to go out and spread it in the field because it's early spring. And the next panel, you show them working on the vines. Well, if you look at the bottom panel, the third one, the bottom row, third panel in, you can see a guy with a stick and some pigs. And what he's doing is he's driving them into the forest because it's late autumn and he wants to fatten them up before slaughter. And so they're being driven into the forest to eat acorns and whatever else it is that they can find that's growing in there. And the landlord, the guy who's there, is just a poor guy. The landlord gives everyone permission to do this with their pigs. So those are the kinds of amenities that the landlord might provide. They also provide things like a mill to grind grain into flour. They would provide the services of a blacksmith very often to make tools and horseshoes and things along those lines. They would provide all kinds of access to goods that would be brought in. Usually people didn't do a lot of travel for themselves to do their trading and purchasing of goods that couldn't be produced locally, but the landlord would sometimes introduce those things into the local village by sort of bringing them himself or herself. In addition to that, things like heavy farm equipment, like a big heavy plow, very expensive, but the landlord might invest in it, and then not only would he use it on his own land that he was cultivating directly with the help of his tenant workers, but he would then lend it to those same tenant workers to use on their individual plots for a certain number of days a year so they could get their plowing done more efficiently. So the landlord would provide these things. In addition to that, it was expected to provide services. So the landlord would provide, first and foremost, security. And this was both an internal and external matter. If someone were to be a bandit or something and come and attack you in your home or your village and be trying to rob you or mess up your crops or something, you would run to the landlord, and it would be considered the landlord's job to protect the community, to go out and stop these bandits, catch them, bring them to justice, or drive them away at the very least. And in the same way, if there was a danger from an outside invader, it was the landlord who was responsible for protecting his land, protecting his tenant farmers, and protecting his economic security that way. It's not altruism. It's part of the job. And in addition to these kind of external threats that might happen, the landlord is expected also to defend against internal problems as well. So if you have a dispute with your neighbor over whose pig is whose, or some issue that you have some problem with them about, you can have them brought before the landlord and your dispute heard and adjudicated by the landlord, who was expected to hold court for the purpose of keeping public order. The landlord was expected to punish criminals in the community as well. So if one of your neighbors decided he was going to steal other people's pigs left and right, it would be the landlord you went to enforce the law. So the landlord holds a lot of hats. He owns the land, he makes plans for the land, he will build houses, he maintains houses, he protects the territory, he keeps law and order, he runs the mill, he does all these kinds of things. And so, as you can imagine, if the landlord is a bad landlord, if they're neglectful and don't keep their end of the bargain up, or if they are terribly abusive, it can be an awful life. You can be in a horrible position as a peasant because this person controls so much, so many aspects of your livelihood and whether your life is a good one or a bad one. So that's the landlord side. On the peasant side, what they're expected to provide are really two things. First, they're expected to provide rent, and this is mostly how landlords become wealthy. This is where they get most of their profits off of farming, though they do farm their own land directly often as well. But what they do is they give out plots of land to their tenants and they negotiate a price, a rent for that land. Almost all peasants in the Middle Ages are going to pay their rent in goods, in kind. So they're going to pay in grain or in animals or in whatever else. At the end of the year after harvest, they will have worked out in their contract what their rent is. Sometimes it's absolute, so you'll owe 16 bushels of wheat and a sheep. It will be your rent. Sometimes it's proportional, so you owe 10% of your harvest as rent, something along those lines. And so peasants pay their rent generally in goods, which the landlord can either use themselves or they can take it to town and sell surplus in order to turn that into cash money or various other goods that they might want or need. And the other thing that tenants provide in exchange for all the stuff the landlord does for them, the other thing that tenants provide is work. They offer their landlord a certain number of days per year. And it varies. The rents and the work expectation vary from farm to farm, from landlord to landlord, from place to place, partly based on how desirable the tenancy is, how desirable the piece of land is to live and work on, and partly based on simply what happened to have been negotiated between the parties involved. It really could be wildly different from one farm to the next farm. But generally speaking, once again, we might be misled by the image that we might have formed from the movies and books and things that portray peasants as living these very bleak and difficult, hard scrabble existences. To think that they probably, if they owed work days to their landlord, probably had to pay a lot of them, that they would have to work 30, 60, 100 days a year in order to live on the land and be protected by the landlord. But that's not the case, as far as we can tell. What records survive, and there are enough of them that we're reasonably confident that this is accurate. The records that survive seem to indicate that the average number of days worked per year as a result of these tenancy agreements ranged between 7 and 14 days. That was typical per year. So that was what you would owe if you were a peasant, and the landlord could, within reason, ask you to do pretty much whatever they wanted with those days. Most people, most years, are going to be employed in harvest and planting, so plowing and harvest. That's when you need the most farm laborers, so that's when the landlord is going to call in most people. But times like sheep shearing, wall rebuilding, if there was any specific task that the landlord needed done, a well dug, something like that, could call in people whenever they happened to need them and use them in whatever way seemed most helpful. And it created a great deal of flexibility, which enabled these manors, these farms, to really exist on these little island communities pretty self-sufficiently. There would be some experts that came in, there would be specialty goods that would be purchased from outside, but generally speaking, almost everything people ate and used and wore and lived inside of was produced locally by themselves, by their neighbors, by their landlord. It was pretty much down to that. And most people had the great majority of the skills they needed to get by. Something like blacksmithing was a specialty skill. But basic tool building and repair, people knew how to do. How to shear a sheep, how to maintain vines, how to, if you had vines, how to plant and harvest grain, how to butcher a pig. Everybody knew how to do these things. And everybody basically did for themselves, basic carpentry, things like that. So that was what the great majority of people's lives were like. They were farmers, they lived as tenant farmers. Landlords owed them a great deal of amenities, services, and provided them with the place to live and security. And in exchange for that, what the peasants provided was stability. They provided a guaranteed labor force at a time when infant mortality was very high, populations did not grow very fast, there were not a lot of people who were available as laborers, and so in the interest of making land into profit, landlords were highly motivated to make sure that their tenants stuck around. And so, for that reason, there would be provisions written in to the tenancy agreements that said that the tenant agreed for sometimes for a term of time. Sometimes these tenant agreements would be basically lifetime agreements. Sometimes they'd be renegotiated annually. It really just depended. But the tenant agreed that they wouldn't leave the farm. So if you took off for more than a day without the landlord's permission, and the people did get permission sometimes to travel, but if you left for more than a day or so, the landlord was within his legal rights to catch you, drag you back, and force you to keep working. So peasants are not exactly free people. They're not slaves that can't be bought and sold, but they are tied to the land for the term of their tenancy. And these tenancy agreements often became multi-generational. You would have families that just were born, lived, and died in the same land. And interacted with the same family that owned that land, born, lived, and died in the same place. And this is really what both landlords and tenants profited from. They had this tremendous guarantee of stability and security. It could go south, it could go wrong, it could go badly on one side or another, and sometimes did. Peasants did rebel and revolt when conditions got bad, and when we look at the records of peasant rebellions and what they were asking for, again, it can be somewhat surprising that peasants had a surprising ability and inclination to push back when they felt that conditions were unfair. They were not nearly as downtrodden as we might picture. And so they would rebel over things like they found out the neighbors were only working 6 days a year and they didn't want to work 7 days a year and they wanted the difference made up. Or there was some kind of access to a market that they wanted or something along those lines. They would often threaten violence against their landlord unless their demands were met. Not to say this happened often, but there are a number of cases of it happening where it worked out, where the peasant population was in fact accommodated by people who got browbeaten into acceding to their demands, because the landlords are, number one, very outnumbered. 80 to 85% of the population are tenant farmers. And on top of that, they are the entire engine by which the landlord makes money. If his tenants aren't going to farm, then there's no way. So collectively, peasants could be quite powerful, and they were willing to act collectively in many cases. Anyway, so that being said, the economics are very different from the modern world. Practically everybody's a farmer. Most people don't really deal heavily in a cash economy. It's just not the kind of robust and varied economy we think of and associate with the modern world. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about people who make up the political leadership and the military leadership. Those two things are absolutely inseparable from one another. Pardon me. Really, and I'll explain why in just a minute. But the political leadership kind of grows out of, if you will, a military hierarchy. Now, I'm speaking in incredibly general terms. Before I talk about generally the structure of medieval politics, I think it's important to emphasize once again that not only was there a tremendous amount of local variation in terms of what legal statutes were being observed, in terms of exactly who was running what and who was taking on which tasks, and who was in charge of any particular thing. There was a lot of variation and a lot of, I guess, difference from one place to another. But in addition to that, the political system gets very complicated very fast. And so you end up with something of a tangle. So keep that in mind as I explain the structure of how it's supposed to work. Within a generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, it turns into a mess. But we'll get to that in just a second. Okay, so how is it supposed to work? Well, let's back up and use an imaginary example to explain. The center of the medieval political system is based on something known as the lord-vassal relationship. A lord is a person who owns or has jurisdiction over land, and a vassal is someone they entrust to take charge of that land for them. So, in my imaginary example, let's imagine that I am a war leader. We'll just be a bit of our imagination there. I'm a war leader of some kind. I've gathered a whole bunch of soldiers up together, and we go on a rampage and we conquer the eastern coast of North America. That's so that's ours now. It belongs to us. Now that I've captured the East Coast, I declare myself a king. I'm the king. This is my land, kingdom of the East Coast. But I look at it and I think to myself, well, there's no phones, there's no radio, there's no railroads or telegraphs or anything I can use to communicate quickly. There's a lot of different territory in there, a lot of different climate regions. It's a huge border. It's just, even though I have this great army that's all been consolidated for conquest, I can't really handle this by myself. I can't oversee the farming and turning of this land into money all by myself, and I can't defend the borders all by myself, because the minute, we march off to address Ohio and they're trying to get into our border over there, then the next thing you know, the pirates of the Caribbean are bothering us down in Florida. So it's just too difficult. I can't control it all myself all at the same time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide it up into packets that I'll call fiefs. And I will entrust those to my most loyal generals, the people who helped me capture this land. As a reward, because I don't necessarily have a lot of cash in my pockets, as a reward, I'll give them a packet apiece. So I turn to my generals and say, aha, you there, you did such a good job. You were such a helpful general. I'm making you the Duke. I'm making you my vassal. I'm giving you New York State in fief. Now, when I say giving it in fief, that's not the same as just giving it as a gift. A fief is not outright ownership. A fief still belongs to the king, but it's loaned out, in essence, to the person it's granted to. So if you make a vassal and give them the fief of New York to run, they can live there. They can build themselves a house. They can collect the rents from all the tenants who are working in that region. They can preside over the local courts. They can, in many cases, make their own local statutes. They certainly will have to enforce their own local statutes. They are going to basically be put in charge of running the place. Sometimes, and it's fairly rare, they may have to pay a portion of their profits as taxes, but generally they don't. Instead, they're just put in charge of this packet of land. They get to take and collect all the profit from it, put it in their pocket, and be able to boss everybody around who lives in that area. In return for this awesome gift, they have to take an oath of fealty, which is an oath of loyalty to the person granting them the fief. So the lord, in this case the king, turns to his general and says, if you swear loyalty to me, I'll give you New York to hold in fief and make you my Duke of New York. So the general says, cool, I'll do that. I'll be your Duke. And so I solemnly swear, as Duke of New York, that I will defend your interests. I will not do anything that will cause the rest of the kingdom damage or cause you any personal damage. So I'm not going to conspire with Canada to go after Vermont. Instead, I'm going to be your loyal subject and act in your interest as far as I can. I also swear that if you ask me for advice, I will show up and advise you. And first and foremost, and the most important thing the king wants when he came up with this whole fief idea, if you ever need military assistance, if you ever decide to go to war against Ohio or against the Midwest or against the Pirates of the Caribbean or something, I will show up and fight alongside you. And since I'm the Duke and I'm being given something as big and important as New York to have as my fief, the king is not stupid. The king is not going to say, all right, show up by yourself to fight in my army. He's going to say, okay, General, now Duke of New York, when I have to go to war, I want you to show up with a certain set number of soldiers. Let's imagine it's 10,000. Show up with your 10,000 soldiers, and then we'll all go together with the rest of the dukes into war if I ask you to. So that's the arrangement. The vassal, the person who takes the fief, swears military service and swears loyalty and swears not to mess up the fief or ruin it or anything, swears to give political advice when asked, and generally be the loyal friend of the king and manage things while the king isn't there. Okay. In return for that, the king is going to make some promises of his own. The king promises that he's not going to act against the interest of his vassal. So he's not going to smash up New York or come to some kind of arrangement with Pennsylvania that will allow them to ruin New York's water supply or something along those lines. The king promises not to act against the interest of his vassal. He promises to listen to advice when vassals offer it, and to show them respect and consideration. And in the case that the vassal needs help, if Canada gets uppity and starts coming for New York, the Duke of New York is entitled to call upon the king of Eastern North America and say, I need your help, show up with the army, come help me out. And the king promises that in the case of kind of mutual attack, they will defend and come to the defense of their vassals if necessary. So it's a two-way street. Both sides owe the other something. Now, because New York is still a big place, the Duke of New York looks around and he says to himself, you know what, I've got the same kind of problem that the king of Eastern North America has. I can't farm all of this myself. I can't oversee it all directly. I can't even defend the borders directly because that would require me to keep a lot of soldiers on hand, and I don't want to feed them all. It's too expensive. I can't do that. So what I'm going to do is parcel it up further and create sub-fiefs. These were still just called fiefs. But I'm going to create other parcels, other fiefs, and I'm going to have vassals of my own. So I'm the vassal of the king, but I can't run this whole show myself. So what I'll do is I'll parcel it up into smaller fiefs and have a bunch of counts. I'm the duke. The next thing down, I'll have counts. And the counts will be given counties, that's where we get that word from, to administer and to run, and they have the same basic deal I have with the king. We swear oaths of loyalty to each other. I ask their advice, they give me advice, I defend them, they defend me. If I have to go to war, I know I have to show up with 10,000 guys to help the king if the king calls on me. So because I'm clever and smart, I think to myself, you know what? I'm going to make sure that I can call on more vassals than I technically need to provide for the king. So if I'm promised 10,000 soldiers, I make sure that when I make a bunch of counts, so I have a count of Onondaga County, and a count of Madison County, and a count of Jefferson County, and a count of Orange County, or whatever else, I'm going to make sure that when you tot up all the guys they owe me, it's going to be a bigger number. So I'm going to have the count of Onondaga County owe me 1,000 soldiers, and Madison County owe me 1,000 soldiers, and Dutchess County, because it's bigger and closer to New York, I'm going to have them owe 2,000 soldiers. And so when you add it all up together, it's going to be 15,000 or 20,000. So that way, if the king calls me to go to war against the Pirates of the Caribbean or whoever else, down in Florida, where I don't really care, frankly, I can show up with 10,000 guys, but I don't have to abandon New York. I can leave enough troops here to keep order and to make sure that it's safe and secure and that Canada doesn't get any ideas and come swooping in while I'm out of town. So, this process is repeated several times over. You have fiefs that are then subdivided into smaller fiefs. You have this chain that's created where the king creates dukes, some big important nobles. And then below the dukes have counts and then viscounts, marquises. There's different titles in different places at different times. It's not really important to know what they all are. But what you should picture in your head is this kind of pyramid where at every level there's more personnel. So there's more counts, more counties than there are states, more states than there are kings, so countries. And so at every level, there's more people controlling smaller parcels of land till you get down to the point where it's manageable, where one person can actually oversee all this territory and make sure it's being farmed profitably and make sure it's being defended adequately. And they're just going to kind of keep the staff they need on hand to do that. And so they're going to generally spend their time on their local affairs. And then if there's a war, this is how it's supposed to work. Brace yourself. Here we go. If there's a war, then the king will say, all right, we need to go to war against Canada. So I want everybody to show up. So all the dukes are called upon to show up with their soldiers. The dukes are like, okay. And they have to call in all the counts to show up with their soldiers. And the counts have to call in the viscounts. And the viscounts have to call in the marquises. And the marquises have to call on their specific knights who should be hanging around. The bottom of this pyramid, by the way, are people who don't have land, who weren't given a fief, but did swear an oath of loyalty. These people are called knights. They have a contractual relationship with a lord, and everybody at every level of the pyramid. There are knights that work directly for the king. There are knights that work for people at the very bottom. So Baron von whatever, at the very bottom of this pyramid of power. But a knight is somebody that doesn't get a piece of land to run or to administer or to profit from. Instead, they literally get a seat at the table. So the lord that hires them lets them eat at his table. If they go to war and there's loot, they get a share of the loot very often. And they generally have this oath of loyalty where they support the lord and the lord supports and protects and provides for them in exchange. Sometimes knights are able to rise through the ranks a bit. They provide distinguished enough service that lords will reward them with an actual fief. Sometimes they don't. They live and they die and they're knights the whole time. So if you want to go to war, though, the process is unwieldy, very unwieldy. It takes quite a lot of doing to get from the king deciding to go to war until all of these banners are called. And if you see Game of Thrones, you've probably heard this term. All the banners are called and everybody shows up. So the process of going to war is unwieldy, and it almost never, ever works totally smoothly. The metaphor that is closest from modern world that I can think of is it's like building a house. If you've ever experienced that or you know anybody who's ever experienced that, people can't generally today build their own houses from start to finish using all their own labor and materials. If you want a house built, you buy the land and then you hire a builder. The builder is going to hire contractors. And there's going to be a person who specifically puts in windows and a person who specifically excavates the foundation and a person who pours the concrete for the basement. And there's a person who does the framing and a person who does the roofing and a person who does every step of this. And so you have a builder, he's got a major job contractor, you've got the job contractor hiring out subcontractors. Sometimes the subcontractors have subcontractors, and it creates this pyramid of people who all answer to somebody directly above them, but it becomes very complicated very fast. In this metaphor, you, the homeowner, the person with the money, are like the king. You're technically running this show. You picked out the design, you told people you wanted a house, and then all of these contractors are theoretically working for you. But the reality is that you have limited contact with people further down the chain. If you're the homeowner in this metaphor, the odds that you actually know who the Windows person is and have any discussion with them ever is quite low. And that's what it's like in the medieval period with the kings. There's this pyramid of vassals, but the odds that the king even really knows anything about the knights that belong to Marquis whoever way over there are really quite low. And if something goes wrong, something always goes wrong. It's a very unwieldy system to get hold of. Just like with the house building metaphor, if you know anybody who's built a house in this way, it never, ever, ever once in the history of building a house has ever gone perfectly smoothly. There's always something that goes haywire. Somebody doesn't show up when they're supposed to show up. Something doesn't happen the way it's supposed to happen. There's miscommunication. Something goes wrong. And when it goes wrong, the homeowner and the king in this metaphor has limited ability to fix that. He's got to kick his complaint down the chain of command until somebody finally deals with it. And that's true in the Middle Ages as well. This whole process becomes very, very complicated very fast. Some of the rules that are supposed to protect kings and vassals in this system, technically, basically everywhere in Europe, it's against the law to hold fiefs from two different people. So if you have a parcel of land that you have from the King of France, you're not supposed to also have a fief from somebody who doesn't answer to the King of France. So you're not supposed to have a fief from the King of England. Because what if France and England got into a fight with each other? Well, it makes sense that that's the law. But practically speaking, it doesn't last. The first generation after conquest works great. The king hands out, rewards parcels of land to all his loyal, close followers. But give it 20 years and those people start to die. And when they die, they have to be replaced. And the king or the king's children at this point, who are now in charge and are now the new king, have to figure out who they want to be the vassal in this fief going forward. Most of the time, it makes logical sense that you would allow the descendants of the original vassal to inherit. That's kind of what they were hoping for. That's what your vassal was hoping for when they took the job. It kind of hard to say no in that case. Even though you technically own the land as the king, it's really hard to refuse. And so people pay a little bit of a little tax, and then they inherit the fief, and then they continue on. Well, once one generation becomes 2 generations, 3 generations, 4 generations, 5 generations of the same family owning the same fief or controlling the same fief, practically speaking, prying them out of there would require more than a crowbar. It's very difficult to do if you're the king. It's difficult to justify. Your other vassals might not back you up. It becomes nightmarish. And what happens generation after generation after generation is that inheritance complicates things. It's possible that you might inherit a fief from your father's side, another fief from your mother's side. You might have married into somebody whose family who owns another fief from over there. And so you have nobles who have multiple conflicting obligations all over the place. It's almost impossible to eliminate. On top of that, you just have personality issues, and this can happen right off from the bat from day one. The way the military works is that the king calls on the army, and the army shows up. And it's not an easy process or a straightforward process, and here's the deal. Since the army is made up of everybody who gets called upon when the king needs them, if they don't show up, the king doesn't have an army. So if the king's like, okay, I want to go to war against Canada, show up everybody. And Vermont is like, yeah, I don't know. I got this good deal with Canada. We got this nice trade thing across the border. I don't really want to go to war with Canada, frankly. And New Hampshire's on my side. And I have this, my cousin is actually the Duke of New York now. And they really thinks that we shouldn't maybe do this. What can happen is the greatest nightmare of any ruler in the Middle Ages. You call on the army to show up and back you up, and the army just goes, nah, and doesn't do it. And if that happens, your options are somewhat limited. You can try. You can try to be like, all right, well, what we're going to do then, if that's how we're playing this, is I will tell the Dukes of Georgia and Florida and Virginia that if they come with me to punish my rebellious vassals in New York and Vermont and New Hampshire, then I'll divide New York and Vermont and New Hampshire and give them out to them instead. So you can try to use threats. You can also try to use bribes. But what happens is that the kings end up with not nearly as much power as you would think with a name like king. And it's quite decentralized. They have to be the hardest working people in show business, kings and queens. They have to beg, borrow, and steal to get anybody to do what they want. So, that being said, I'm sure you're asking yourself, why, for centuries, did medieval people do this? Why did they use this system if it was so unwieldy? Well, it's a complicated question, but generally speaking, they used it because it was the cheapest way. It was the most efficient way, the same reason we use it to build houses. Because if a person's specialty is putting in windows, you don't want to keep that person on your staff all the time. You only want to build 1 or 2 or 3 houses in your lifetime. You don't want to employ a window installer permanently for those few occasions when you need them. It's too expensive. And likewise, this system enables specialization. If you have a difficulty communicating in a large territory to cover, and you're the king, you can't be expected to know like the best choices for farm cultivation in Florida and in Maine. It's too much to have to try to handle on the micromanaging level. And so, by creating this decentralized authority structure, you can ensure that local administration goes fairly smoothly, that your local administrators, your nobles, are highly incentivized to keep their own territory in good condition and in safe condition, and to do the best they can to be profitable because their own wealth is tied to how good a job they do. And the security is tied to how well they actually will answer and provide for protection for their own borders. So it works, and it's not cripplingly expensive. You don't have to worry about trying to maintain an army of thousands and thousands of people all at once. And it also allows for fast response times. If invaders, attackers like Vikings, we'll talk about them. It's a little bit of a misnomer, but we all know what we mean by Vikings. So, if attackers like Vikings come and cause problems, then you can rapidly respond if you're Johnny on the spot. If your noble is there with knights that are at his disposal, if they've got a fortification like a castle that's right on the river, then the response can come instantaneously. If you have to wait for the king to show up to defend against Vikings, fat chance of that working, because they're going to get back in their ships and sail away long before he can call on the vassals who call on their vassals who turn up. Even if he had a standing army, an army he was keeping hanging around, by the time they march it to wherever there's a problem, the ships are gone. And so this system does work. It works for centuries, and they stick with it for centuries because it is functional. It does work out. It is not a system that lends itself to kings having an easy and fun time of it, but it is one that does function. Okay, another thing about the armies before we move on. There's things to know about them. As I mentioned a little bit when we talked about the economy, armies are made up in the Middle Ages of a class of professional soldiers, whether you're a knight or whether you are a duke or the king himself or the queen herself. Armies are made up of people who generally spend years and years and years from the time of childhood training. They have specialized equipment. Even relatively lowly knights are going to have fairly expensive equipment. There are more foot soldiers than there are mounted knights in the medieval armies of any particular region at any given time. But that being said, the mounted armored knight is the absolute military core of the armies of the day. They're the most dangerous portion, the most valuable portion, and the people who make up that class of people, that class of soldier, are the most politically influential members of both the state, both the politics, both the government, and the army. So it's very different from the modern world in this way. Armies are not made up of common people. They're not made up of peasants. They're not made up of farm laborers, unless it's a really extreme and unusual emergency. Instead, armies are made up of people who do this professionally and have very expensive equipment. As a result, quite predictably, armies are quite a bit smaller than they are in the modern world. It's very unusual for a medieval army to be much over 10,000 people. Even in big expeditions where the king has called in the banners and everybody is supposed to show up, if there are 50,000 people on a battlefield, that was considered extraordinarily large. That's a huge battle by medieval standards. And by modern standards, that's really, really very small. Casualty levels are also quite low compared to modern standards. This doesn't mean that fighting wasn't brutal, bloody, and deadly. It was. But casualty rates are much, much smaller. People are using bladed weapons and they're heavily armored. There's a lot of taking captives and ransoming them back. It's not the same kind of mechanized bloodbath that you see with 20th century fighting. It is awful and brutal in its own way, but you don't see tens and 20,000 people dying in a battle. It just doesn't happen, or at least it happens extraordinarily rarely. Instead, casualty levels tended to be low, and part of that, just speaking cynically, has to do with the fact that people in the upper classes are making up the army. They're doing most of the fighting. They're not that replaceable in their own eyes, and they're the ones making decisions. And so that's going to color whether they decide to go to war or not. On the flip side of that coin, because warfare was not automatically destruction, it wasn't automatically apocalyptic in the way that the wars of the 20th century become. It was often seen as a legitimate, option that you might do. Like, well, I'm not sure what our political interests are. Maybe we'll declare war on France this year. Because there's a possibility we might gain territory, we might gain loot. We could actually come out ahead in that analysis, and that it won't cost us particularly a lot. So you have constant low level warfare going on. And it wasn't necessarily seen as a politically bad move or one that came at a tremendous sacrifice to do. Nevertheless, because people are in the ruling class who are making the decision about whether to go to war or not, you could make the argument that they are much less willing to get into situations where they're going to take very heavy losses. Okay, it's politically a mess, even if you're the king, and it's not something people are willing to volunteer for. And the people who are in the army are people who are accustomed to having a great deal of influence in their own lives. They're accustomed to being able to call the shots very often, and so that's a plus and a minus. On the plus side, they're quite independent and can be trusted to carry out a lot of things kind of on their own. And on the other hand, they don't always take orders particularly well. And that's another problem that medieval kings have. Okay, so that all brings us to the church. Now, we could probably spend an entire hour talking about the church in medieval Europe and its impacts and its importance and its structure, and still have more to talk about by the time that hour was over. So I'm going to try to make this as succinct as I possibly can. And if I don't quite succeed, bear with me. We'll explain in our discussion next week. All right, so there really is one big game in town when it comes to medieval Europe and religion. The biggest game is the Catholic Church. It is the Christian church. There are not any Protestant churches. It hasn't been invented yet. There are a few schismatic groups, people who are labeled by the official Catholic hierarchy as heretics or as wrong believers, people who have difference of opinion, and they're condemned, and there's wars, and there's some complications in that way. But generally speaking, if you're a Christian in Europe in the Middle Ages, you're a Catholic. Exactly what that meant to people varied from place to place and time to time. There were some religious minorities. There was a sizable minority of Jewish people sprinkled throughout Europe, but specifically more concentrated in Eastern and Southern Europe. And there also was a significant number of Muslims, particularly concentrated in Spain and around Spain, but they did travel elsewhere in Europe as well. In most of the time we're going to be talking about, and in most of the time we could define as medieval Europe, places where large numbers of Muslim people lived were self-governing and where had Muslim governments, and so that wasn't so much a case of religious minorities that had to fight with Catholic administration. But Jewish populations did often find themselves in that position where they had to negotiate with Catholic kings and queens and local leaders and populations and bishops and whatnot. And sometimes that went reasonably okay, and sometimes there was a fair amount of persecution. It really just kind of depended on the situation. But that being said, the Catholic Church is the game in town, but it is an enormously complicated institution, particularly by the end of our time period, by 1100 or so. From the very beginning, the Catholic Church in 500 or so, as it's spreading into what will become defined as medieval Europe, really is inextricably, inseparably linked with political leadership. Kings are going to use the church and church leaders and clergy. Clergy are people who work for the church, in order to promote and expand their own authority. They're going to use the technologies, and in this case, I'm talking about reading and writing, and record keeping and administrative techniques of the church to help create their governments. And so the kingdoms of Europe are absolutely just drawn up with the church just kind of threading through the entire thing. They're impossible to pull apart. And so you can't really talk about the politics of Europe without talking about the church, and vice versa. The Catholic Church in general is split into two major, I guess, categories. The first is a bit of an oxymoron. It's called the secular clergy. Secular refers to not the church, life outside the church, if you will. And so secular clergy, even though the term is an oxymoron, because secular means not in the church and clergy means in the church, even though the term is an oxymoron, it refers to the type of people who work for the church, the clergy, who interact directly and minister directly and run administrations directly that impact and deal with and negotiate with people who aren't in the church. So this would be everybody from deacons and priests through archbishops, and at the tippy top of the pyramid of administrative power, you have the Pope. The Pope is technically in charge of everything. His real title is the Bishop of Rome, but he's given preeminence in the entire Catholic Church, and he's technically the top of the food chain. And everybody is supposed to answer to him in a hierarchy that looks a lot like that Lord Vassal hierarchy we broke down. So that's technically what's supposed to be the case throughout pretty much all of our time period, between 500 and 1100 AD or so. That's not practically the case, however. The Pope is technically in charge, but realistically, just like with the nobles and the king, local authority figures kind of, sort of, maybe kind of listen to him sometimes, but most of the time do their own thing and don't listen or care. And he doesn't necessarily know what's going on in far-reaching areas of Christendom. So the Pope is technically in charge, but not effectively all that powerful a figure. The other parts of the administration, however, are really powerful figures. Local church members, local clergy like deacons and priests. Deacons would be people who serve the church as ministers, but are not, they don't take the oaths of poverty, chastity, obedience. They don't take the full holy orders. And so they're not ordained as priests. But priests and deacons are going to be working very directly with communities of people on the ground, and then they are going to answer to people who are above them in the hierarchy, people like bishops. A bishop would be a person who's in charge of a Christian community in a large town or small city. So Syracuse might have a bishop, say, in this model. Um, did we have an archbishop? I don't know. I don't think so. But Syracuse might have a bishop. Rochester, Buffalo, they'd have bishops. And then above them would be archbishops. Archbishops would be people who were in charge of a big city, a big community of Christians. So New York City would have an archbishop. So your local town, let's imagine you lived in Marcellus. Marcellus has a priest, then Syracuse has a bishop, then New York City has an archbishop, and the archbishop can interact directly with the Pope. But that's not the only pathway to power if you're in the secular clergy. The secular clergy also is going to interact very directly and intimately with the local political leadership. There are a couple of reasons for this. Number one, the church is an enormous landowner. Both branches, the secular clergy we've already started talking about, and the monastic side of the church, which we will talk about in a moment, own tremendous swaths of land in Europe. And this amount only grows from 500 to 1100 or so. Some of this happens just quite naturally. As people die, they might donate land to the church. Usually it's nobles who own land who are able to do this. They maybe lived a little bit of a sketchy life. They have some anxieties about the afterlife. And so they try to hedge their bets just a little bit by leaving a big donation to the church. Sometimes, and this is skipping over a tiny bit into the monasteries, but we'll circle back to this, they might leave this land and some funds so that a monastery could be built on it specifically, but it belongs to the church. And here's the thing about the church. As an institution, it doesn't allow its individual members, its priests and its bishops, to inherit anything personally. Once they join the church, everything collectively belongs to the church. And so what happens is that all of this property just kind of grows and grows and grows over time. The church never gets rid of it. On rare occasions, they might sell it, but they generally don't. They just accumulate more and more and more and more. And they also have money at their disposal. That's another process that we need to talk about. Everybody who belongs to the Christian church, and in some cases people who don't, depending on how unlucky you are as a Jewish person who might be living in a town in Europe, everybody who belongs to the Christian church is expected to do something called tithing, which is to pay 10% of their profits and donate it into the church. And your local church, if you did this in, say, imagine you live in Marcellus and you tithe and you give 10% of your income to your church is then supposed to tithe as well. So they take 90% of the money they bring in and spend it locally. They provide a food bank. In the Middle Ages, literally they did that. They would be the ones that provide alms or care for beggars, widows, orphans, anybody who was vulnerable, poor, who was at risk of starvation. To the extent that there was any social welfare at all, it was the church that provided it. And they did. It wasn't to say they didn't do it. They did do it. And so they would provide that to the community. The church would also pay for things like feasts. And so they might sponsor a feast and purchase food and put on a celebration for the town. And this would generate revenue in some cases because they'd bring in, the stuff for people to come and spend money. If they were staging a fair or something. And they also, these feasts, it sounds a little odd to our modern sensibilities. But if you're in a poor area where people's diet was somewhat restricted, or their calorie intake and their protein intake in particular might be a little on the sketchy side, some of these church feasts that would be held periodically throughout the year and paid for with these church tithe funds would sometimes make the difference between whether people were well nourished or not, whether they were healthy or not, whether they got enough to eat to avoid the danger of starvation or malnutrition, if not starvation outright. So this was an important thing that the church provided. The church also could use that money and create building projects to build a church that then everybody could go and use and would put people to work in the interim. Basically, the money was supposed to go into the community, 90%, and then 10% would be kicked up the chain. So your local town, say Marcellus, would kick 10% of what they brought in to Syracuse. Meanwhile, everybody else in the local community was doing the same thing. So Fayetteville and DeWitt and Jamesville and Salina and everybody else who's kind of around Cicero, everyone who's around Syracuse is doing the same thing. They're kicking their 10% in. And so at that next level, the bishop has a lot of money at his disposal. And so he's supposed to do the same kind of thing, spend 90% of it locally on whatever it is the church needs. And his district is much larger. So he can redirect funds to towns that are doing badly because of a crop failure. He can take that money and buy political influence. He can take that money and buy land. He can take that money and build bridges or cathedrals. He can take that money and do largely whatever he wants with it. And that can be a lot, in fact, of resources that are at the disposal of the bishop, who can basically command the labor force that would be equivalent to somebody like a duke. It's somebody who's very important, bishops are, and archbishops even more so. And on top of all this, the priest and the bishop and the archbishop and the pope have a religious role as well, an honest to goodness one. So they're the ones who offer their opinions about doctrine, about the church teachings, about what the nature of Jesus is, about what the rules of the church and what moral behavior should be allowed and discouraged. They do that at this and preach sermons, from churches at the same time that they're running all of this land, and they have tenant farmers just like everyone else. They have all this money at their disposal, which they can use however they see fit. And at the same time, they have access to this administrative hierarchy that will put them in contact at the top directly with the king. The king and high nobles lean on the church quite a bit, because the church, in addition to having all this money and land at their disposal, the church also is the place that runs the administrative branch of the government in large part during the Middle Ages. The church started out doing this. They were the ones who could read and write, specifically in Latin, so that was a handy little code. And it makes it possible for clergy all across Europe to talk and communicate with each other very easily without needing translation. But it means that they were the ones who were reading and writing messages. They were the ones who were in charge of education. So to the extent that literacy is spread, and it varies tremendously from one region to another in Europe during the Middle Ages and one time to another, to the extent that literacy spreads, it's often the church that's organizing schools to teach people to read and write if they in fact learn. In addition to that, the church is keeping records, births, deaths, marriages, land sales. It made sense, since the church was the place where people could read and write. In addition to recording how many people are in their community, which the church was doing for themselves already, people who had any kind of legal interaction with each other they wanted a record of would go down to the church and say, hey, I'm going to sell a parcel of land to my neighbor. I would like you to witness that and to record it and keep a record of it. So in 10 or 20 or 50 years, when people argue over exactly where the boundary's drawn, they can go down to the church and access the records and see what the deal is. In addition to that, logically enough, it grows out of the fact that they keep the records and are often the people who witness agreements between people, verbal agreements, that if there are disputes between one person and another, the church offers their services in that way as well. You could go down to the church and have your clergy member adjudicate your dispute. They could sit in court, in essence, and hear disputes and decide and make a judgment between two claimants. Now, this becomes a point of argument between the government and the church. They get into a big fight with each other about this that is only going to get worse and worse and worse toward 1100. Because there are church courts and then there are political courts that are run by people who are not affiliated with the church. And kings, logically enough, want to have most affairs dealt with in their own court system, whereas the church wants exactly the opposite. And so they get into a fight over whose business needs to be heard where and whether the church is empowered to make legal judgments or not. It's a huge, big stink. Complicating factors throughout the Middle Ages is the fact that because these high church officials, especially bishops and archbishops, have so much power, they have so much money at their disposal, it's really, really tempting to want to have a piece of that if you're a local noble family. You certainly don't want to leave the church there as a potential rival, because that is one of the other things the church is supposed to do. Because you have that manor system where people live on the land and they're tenant farmers and their landlord provides everything for them, that's a system that it works in a lot of cases, but it's a system that is vulnerable to abusive people. If you're an abusive landlord, you have a tremendous amount of control over people's lives. And who can they appeal to? A tenant farmer from the south of France is never going to meet the king, and they couldn't get in to see them. They're not allowed to leave their land, even if they have a complaint. So how do you take it over your landlord's head if there's this problem and he's abusing you? One of the only options you have is to go to the church. You go to your local clergy person, and your clergy person then could either help resolve this dispute by negotiating with your landlord, or could kick it over his own head. And so your local priest could take it to the bishop, and the bishop could come swooping in and deal with your landlord if there's a real problem. And so bishops and archbishops become some of the few rivals to political authority that there are, and one of the few courts of appeal that people have if they're being mistreated by the government is they can turn to the church and hope the church will help them and protect them. This does sometimes happen. So, if you're the local duke, if you're the Duke of New York, and you find out that the Bishop of Syracuse is constantly undermining your decisions by taking you to court and causing all kinds of problems, and then you're constantly having to pay fines, and it's a huge big stink, and you hate it, and it's driving you crazy. And then one day, purely by natural causes, the Bishop of Syracuse dies. And now, because you are bishop until you die or until you get promoted, the Bishop of Syracuse is dead. Now there's an opening. Technically, what's supposed to happen is that all the priests affiliated and associated with Syracuse Diocese are supposed to vote on who gets to be the new bishop. But if you're the duke, you've got a lot of money. You've got a lot of political influence. You've got a lot of power. So what if you pull that into action? You bribe, you threaten, you lean on people who owe you favors, and you make sure that the person who becomes the new Bishop of Syracuse is not some jerk who's going to undermine you at every turn, but is somebody you like, somebody you trust, somebody you can count on. Maybe your brother. It becomes really common in the Middle Ages for local noble families to devote at least a portion of their family into and send them off from the time of children to receive the necessary education, and devote them to life as professional clergy in order to pursue the interests of the family from that side of the government as well. So it really gets kind of hairy. And all of the different parts of life are intertwined with each other. You got the church all embroiled with politics. You've got everybody's embroiled with this economic system. Everything is all mixed in together. And then on top of that, you've got the monasteries. So that's the last place we're going to go today. The monastery system. The secular clergy is that hierarchy of people who actually minister and interact with the public. On the other side, and we'll talk about this in more detail next week, on the other side you have monastic institutions. They'll be founded often by noble families who'll give them a big donation as a place to retreat, a place to go where you don't have to interact with the outside world. They will be populated by monks and nuns. There are both female and male houses. And the female houses are often called convents, where nuns live. Sometimes there are double abbeys, where you have both nuns on one side and monks on the other side. They don't interact with each other. They're kept separate as populations, but they would both live broadly under the same institution. And most of them are going to live under the Benedictine rule, which we'll explain in more detail next time. But that involves spending a third of their life in prayer, a third of their life in work doing whatever it is they need to do to support the monastery, farm work, or in the case of convents, very famously, they produce luxury like linen goods and various other kinds of like fabrics. Places in Belgium will innovate the production of beer. That's the other thing they spend their time in. They spend a third of their time in prayer, a third of their time in work, and a third of their time in study. And some of that is recording and preserving the works of the ancient world. And sometimes that study involves making actual scientific innovations. And so, particularly when it's associated with ways to support the monastery. And so that's why those Belgian monks are so good at brewing beer. They make a very scientific inquiry into the best methodology and the best results and how to accomplish it so that they can produce what they want for themselves, but also sell it at a bit of a profit and support the monastery as well. Dom Perignon, if you're familiar with that name, that famous champagne, it's named after Brother Perignon, who or Father Perignon, who is another one of those monks who is going to innovate and create champagne, in essence, by this kind of methodology of inquiry. Everything from beekeeping to fish farming to champagne production is innovated by this. And the monasteries are going to occupy a really complicated niche in medieval society. They are seen as important religiously, where people think of them as providing a real and significant contribution to society by praying for the souls of people who can't afford to live these dedicated lives in the service of God. And they also are going to serve as places that provide safety valves, so that if you are a person who finds themselves in the political hot seat, if you're let's say your husband decided to rebel against the king and tried to put himself on the throne and failed and died, and now you're just kind of a widow, and you're afraid that somebody's going to strong arm you into marrying them so they can go attack the king. You could take the option, or be pushed into the option, depending, of entering a convent and getting out of the political mess. The same thing went for men. If things went bad for you, or if you were just getting to the point where you're old and you're sick of it, and you're like, I can't live a life where I fight people all the time anymore. I don't want to do this. I want to retire. One of the more comfortable places, one of the safest ways you could retire, is to enter a monastery or a convent where it would be considered well beyond the pale. You can't be attacked while you're there. I mean, you could be, but it's not considered acceptable to go after your political enemies once they've left society. By joining one of these monasteries, you declare yourself to be out. You're out of it. And so theoretically, you should be safe as a result of that. They do provide a very important economic kind of cornerstone to the church's properties. They own a lot of land, and with that land ownership, they're important landlords. They're important economically in society, and they end up being places where people donate a lot of wealth and they control a lot of wealth. And so abbots and abbesses, the leaders of these monasteries, end up being politically important, even though they're supposed to be withdrawn from society. So the long story short, the church is absolutely intertwined with everything. When I say the church, I really only mean the Catholic Church. It's the only game in town, or it's the biggest game in town. And politics, the church, the military, all of it is absolutely a tangle in the Middle Ages. It's all wrapped up with itself, with each other, and important families end up putting their tentacles into kind of every aspect of life. They're controlling how tenant farmers experience their day-to-day lives. They're controlling the church in various local places. There's the church pushing back against local political control. There's these constant tensions as well. The king wants to control more. He wants more power centralized so that he doesn't have to fight every second to get influence in his kingdom. Local nobles want the opposite. They want more independence. They don't want the king bossing them around. They want to be able to do their own thing more. And the balance of power is going to flip back and forth between them. It's going to kind of flow. But generally speaking, medieval Europe is a time when Power is mostly decentralized. People live very local lives. They don't travel a heck of a lot. Most people use farming as their way of making a living. Even if you're in the clergy, how they support themselves is farming. So um, that's the linchpin of the entire economy, and that really characterizes how people experience their lives. So, that all being said, next time we're going to start talking about the forces that cause all of that to start to change. So, thank you very much for your patience, and I will see you next time.